Oh, Lord. So I'm going to tell you 7 stories. Who here in July celebrated the birth of the new heir to the throne? No? No, I didn't either. The reason I didn't, one is because I'm a Republican and just can't see the point of the whole shabby lot. But the other reason is because on the 22nd of July this year, my family in our somewhat repressed Ulster, though you can't hear in my accent, Presbyterian ways, were commemorating what would have been the man on the left there's 100th birthday. That's my grandfather, Bertie. Bertie was a physicist. He graduated from Queen's University in Belfast in 1936. He went to work for the General Electric Company, the British one, not the Jack Welch American thing. And in the late 30s and through the war, he developed analog computers, mechanical devices to work out when things should blow up. It wasn't a particularly pleasant thing to be doing, but obviously given the time, well, it was kind of important. And then he went into the world of electronics and telecommunications. He designed this. This is the Marconi DET22. It was very important at the time, apparently. This is the predecessor of what became transistors and the predecessor of what became microprocessors. It fries my mind to think how you go about actually designing something like that. And then he got seriously into the telecommunications game, and he designed the demodulation circuits that the first 20 or so years of transatlantic television broadcasting passed through at Goonhilly Downs. That's a Qatari stamp with a picture of a Goonhilly dish. Very bizarre. And then the early 70s, he went out to Zambia. That's me. You see, the real irony is before I lost my hair, I was ginger. Fate throws out mean hands. So we went out to visit them in 1974. Some of my earliest memories of walking around in Lusaka and going to the game reserves and going here to Victoria Falls, where I developed my fear of heights. And the reason Grandad was out there was because he was building this, the Mwembeshi Earth Station. It was what connected Zambia to the rest of the world from a telecommunications perspective. And he obviously didn't just build it himself. He had a group of people working for him. But and that was something that was so important to the Zambian nation that they commemorated it in a number of ways, including issuing this set of stamps, which I have framed next to my desk at home. And that's a short way of saying why my brand is called Stamp. We want to be able to do things with communications and technologies that get commemorated in similar ways. I've got no idea what that will be, but it's a kind of longer-term personal goal. Now, there is a conceit that I think every generation has, and the conceit, we've heard it a lot over the last 2 days, and that conceit is that we are in a period of unprecedented technological change. Every generation thinks the same, pretty much, since at least the Industrial Revolution. If you think within my grandfather's lifetime, from 1913 until his unfortunate death-related incident in 2004, just old age, he sort of expired really. He saw, not the invention of the automobile, but certainly it going from a niche novelty to being mass transport. He saw the telephone again going from being a business tool to being in every home. He saw radio going from Marconi's telecommunication point-to-point communication device to the BBC coming along and it becoming the mass medium. He saw the mass media popularity, the increase of movies, and also its move from being a general medium to being a sort of arts medium because of the advent of television. And he also saw most of the evolution of computer technology within his lifetime as well. Now, I kind of think that, checking in on Foursquare doesn't really compete with that sort of stuff. It's important, but... And I think also that what we saw through that generation and what we saw when we had the talk about the future yesterday with things like nanotech and biotech stuff, this was technology by engineers that was able to do something totally new in many ways and change the world as a result. But what we mostly do is take things and combine them and subtract them and recombine them, as Dave was saying yesterday, to be able to do important things. But those important things, it's crucial that we understand the needs of the people who use them, because we're not changing the world quite in the way that Marconi did or John Logie Baird did. Does anybody know when we stopped calling programmers programmers and call them developers? No, a weird shift happened. If we think back to the programmers, the world of programming was part of the military-industrial complex. It was engineering. It was people in white coats or in uniform. That looks like a proper computer to me. None of this tablet nonsense. Tapes and all sorts. And the history of it, I think, is really important because it actually shapes a lot of the ways in which we still go around developing software. The history of it was engineering, and much of what computing was doing, right up until the advent, really, of the web, I would argue, was continuing the sorts of things that F.W. Taylor and Henry Ford did by production lining stuff. It wasn't about people. It was about taking processes and automating those processes and finding the one right perfect way to do a particular stage of that process and making it repeatable and repeatable and repeatable. And that doesn't lead to particularly fulfilling jobs. And when that sort of approach is taken to the way in which software is developed, we get this. These are absolutely horrible things. They should be banned. They should be blown up. I was in Marks and Spencer's at the weekend with my two sons. They're a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. I've not heard the words unexpected item in the bagging area quite so much as they lifted things up and put them down and lifted things down. And the guy from the help desk came over and he said, yeah, they're a bit shit, these machines, aren't they? I thought, In W.H. Smith's, they've accurately replicated the process to such an extent that you're expected to upsell the shit chocolate bar at the end of your transaction. So you leave frustrated with the technology and feeling dirty for not being able to sell something to yourself. But then we had this revolution that started with this kind of stuff. I love this. Netscape Navigator in a box and the little thing there saying, most users simply downloaded, but some went to shops to be able to buy. Weird, well. And this changed the world, and I think by accident. And the accident was because of the nature of the architecture, the way in which the internet works, and certainly the World Wide Web particularly works. Because it's all a matter of call and response, what you end up with is this. And unlike any time before, and certainly I was working on client-service computing in the 90s, and you never had an idea about how people were using the systems other than through the output of what they did. And all of a sudden, through server logs, you were able to tell actually a lot more information about how people actually used the software. And that was quite revolutionary. And you got people starting to develop software like, what was it, Web Trends? I can't remember back in the day. But those tools that would analyse server logs and tell you information that may or may not be of value about how your web thing was being used. And that in turn led to things like A/B testing. Has anybody used eye tracking tools for user experience and user interface design? Fascinating stuff. That is Tobii, a Scandinavian company. Tracks where your eyes go, gives you a heat map of how people are actually using the tool. And you find out that most of the things that you've done aren't looked at. It's quite disappointing. A friend of mine had this system, and he tried it out when Google first introduced Instant, you know, where you type in and search results appear at the bottom. And what he found was that it was useless. Because if you're a touch typist, you look at where you type. And if you're not a touch typist, you look at the keyboard. And he trialled it with a number of people, and not a single person looked at the results coming up at the bottom. That's what happens when you have just looking at the server-side approach and this data-driven approach to thinking about how you design user interfaces. You end up with stuff that's really great from an engineering perspective, but fucking pointless from a usability perspective. Because they lose empathy with the people who are using the tools. Now, I personally believe that much of the technology industry is endemically, structurally autistic. This is a harsh term, I know, but if you imagine the world of tech as a person and you run an assessment against the sorts of things that are prevalent with people with autism, you find that the way the tech industry work actually is often very similar to that. Now, that's an engineering thing, and it's not a bad thing, because I think Rory Sutherland at Ogilvy describes engineering as the academic approach of removing ambiguity from the world. That way of thinking, you need to be able to think about it very logically and very rationally. Design, whether that's graphic design or the broader idea of design processes, though, I fear is going in the same direction. And I think that he's kind of responsible for that. Now, hear me out on here. I realise this might be a contentious subject with the audience. So, Johnny produces beautiful things. Johnny produces things that are very much influenced by the modernist movement, the Bauhaus movement, by Braun, Dieter Rams there, Mies van der Rohe. And that's great. Beautiful, beautiful objects. And now we've got the software side under Johnny's control as well. We're seeing the emergence of flat design and the removal of skeuomorphism. And in competition, we see people like Microsoft producing authentically digital design through things like Windows 8. But these beautiful modernist objects are then stuck in leatherette cases. And actually, if you think about it, modernism is nearly 100 years old. Postmodernism was 40 years ago or something. Certainly sociological postmodernism. And we might as well have an arts and crafts-led user interface and device world. Why doesn't William Morris figure more in this? Paisley patterns. Because historically, it's about as sensible. What we've got is a series of fashions at the moment, but the flat design thing, the anti-skeuomorphism thing, I fear is actually turning into a sort of design Nazism, where things are being done because that's the fashion, not because it's what people who use these things actually want or need. And that's a very dangerous world. I'll come on to why. I, in 2000, bought the ground floor of this place in Ballantine. And it's a tiny little one-bedroom flat, a little bit of a garden. And we managed to fashion from what was a cupboard under the stairs a deluxe office suite. I say an office suite, it was a desk in a cupboard. And we got it decorated and we put a desk in, and then we needed to get some electric points. And my ex-wife, a colleague of hers at work, her husband, Dave, was a bit of a handyman, odd job sort of thing. A bit of a stoner as well from memory. And he came round, and because I'd been so involved in the world of traditional IT and computer development and stuff, in my mind, what I expected him to do was to come round and say, "What do you want?" And I'd prepared that answer. I wanted 4. So you do it all right. Thing is, when Dave arrived, what are you going to do when you sit at the desk? It's nothing like his accent. He was Cypriot, but I can't do accents. So I thought about it. Well, we'll have the laptop there and a desk lamp and a scanner and an external CD writer, 13 years ago. And it'd be good to plug the mobile phone in there. And they thought about it and said, we'll put 8 in. Because what he'd done was actually to explore my needs, to empathise with what it was I wanted to do, rather than merely expect that I knew what I wanted. Which has been a big problem in IT development over many years. The number of times, why don't these users know what they want? It's because you're not asking the right questions. Now, that was fine because Dave had access to the end client. That makes it much easier if you can ask the right questions. But often the work that you guys will be doing, you won't be. What you'll be doing is you'll be delivering to a client, and between you, you've got to second guess what it is that those end customers, users, whatever you want to call them, need, want, desire. In my 2 and a bit years at Microsoft, I got to meet some fascinating people. Really, really fascinating people. And Boz there was one of them. Boz, up until 2003, was a world-class hurdler. And in 2003, he was running in the finals of the, I think, 400 metres hurdles in Paris at the World Championships. I can't remember which hurdle it was, but he fell and landed so heavily that he sustained an injury that ended his athletics career. But as a man who had been trained to overcome obstacles, thank you, that was a sympathetic laugh. That was better. He basically went and did a multimedia course at Teesside, set up a company called 13 Strides. They're a digital agency and they work specifically in the sports arena. That's not an intended pun, but... Yeah. They were doing some work for a client who organised big marathons and half marathons. And it wasn't Nike, but what they were doing, they wanted to build some apps. And the problem was that they had lots and lots of ideas, but because 13 Strides, the agency, were mostly ex-athletes, and because the client were mostly ex-athletes, they were thinking about it from the perspective of athletes, which meant that what they were coming up with was basically stuff that felt like it was going to be in direct competition with things like Runkeeper, and that seemed to me to be a really bad idea. But I needed a way to be able to work with them to get them to think of new ideas rather than just bowling in and going, that's shit, mate, because it doesn't build much empathy if you do it that way. So what we did, we organised a one-day session. The first part, we got them to tell stories. And we got them to tell stories about great experiences they'd had in their lives, specifically not sporting experiences. So experiences they'd had at school, for example. You can spot me there. I had hair. I had long hair. See the dark glasses at the back? Oh, beautiful. Experiences they may have had with friends or family. And we got them to talk about those and share those stories. And so then what we did was we sort of drew out a series of benchmarks. Sorry, bad visual pun, but that meant that we had a metric against which we could make decisions for the rest of the day. And the sorts of things that came out were the sense of anticipation leading up to the event, or the experience of being able to tell others about it afterwards. And there were 3 or 4 that we drew out. And that became our yardstick. Then we thought about some personas, and we drew out 2. The first were first-time runners, not athletes. About 60% of the people who take part in the events that the client runs, done it again, were people who were doing it for the first time. And their needs are very, very different from a professional athlete. And then the other group were the friends and family of those first-time runners, who are absolutely vital to somebody being successful in taking part in a marathon or a half marathon. And we split the group then into 2, and we got them to think about, from the moment somebody thought, I might take part in one of these events, through to having completed it and being able to tell everybody about it down the pub. And we got them to map out the key milestones that they thought those people would be doing through that 6 months, 9 months, whatever it might be. And by that stage, we'd immersed them in thinking about the end customer. And then we got into a more traditional kind of rapid application model, agile thing, post-its, kind of thing. But Boz got in touch with me afterwards and he said that it totally changed the way in which they thought about how they were doing that client's work, but also other people's, because it enabled them to be able to step back and get into the mind of the end user in a way that they hadn't been able to, because they were so close to it, because they were experts in that field. The output of that should be being launched later this month, I believe. So, empathy in the way in which we approach the design process to be able to get to the needs and the wants and the desires of the people who we are building things for. Why is this so important? Well, it's bloody obvious why it's so important to me, but maybe not to others. But there's a coming crisis, I don't know, there's a coming wake-up call on this. Take you back to this photo. My grandfather, my grandmother, my Uncle David. This is after he had the incident with the nail file and the piece of wool, which left him blind in one eye, which meant he became superb for the photography industry, because he didn't ever have to worry about shutting one eye. It's true, he was the head of Hasselblad in the UK for quite a number of years. Actually, on a Hasselblad, though, you didn't. Anyway, my granddad's a bit older now. Sorry, my dad is a bit older now. My granddad's dead. And there he is, the luxuriant, full head of hair that he especially grows long whenever I'm going up to visit, just so we can do that every so often. Not a grey in it. He's 72. How I've aged. That's my son Milo, my youngest son. Now, Dad retired a few years back now. Had a bit of illness, got through that, which is great. He's now living up in Suffolk with my mum, and he's very involved in the University of the Third Age, which I don't know if people know, but it's basically Darby and Joan Club for people with intellectual pretensions. That's such a damning thing. Sorry, Dad. I had to, it's funny. Anyway, he set up a group called the Community Technology Group, and they're using devices. Actually, not these. He emailed me last night because he looked at the slides and he said, we're using Arduino. BlackBerry Pi, Raspberry Pi are things that are used by people in their 40s hankering after the days of the BBC Micro. And I think he was having a direct go at me about that. But they're using Arduino and they're building stuff. And he's got a group of about a dozen people, mostly in their 70s and 80s, learning to code. It's like the exact opposite of what we heard earlier from Claire. And the interesting thing is this experience, what I was expecting was it would end up with lots of bits of kit littered all over the house, annoying my mum. And what it has ended up with is little bits of kit all over the house, annoying my mum. But it has also politicised my father. And that I wasn't expecting. And it's politicised him because what it's made him realise is that technology that is aimed at people of his age is exclusively assistive technology. The only stuff that we are building for people in their post-work lives is stuff that assumes that they're failing, physically, mentally, and some of them are, let's be honest. But that's angered my dad because he's saying, well, where's the stuff for us? But the community technology group, where they're building stuff and they're working with others within the community to build more stuff, and they're tied into some work with UCL around this now as well. What it's doing, it's meaning they can just build it themselves. And this is the thing about empathy in design processes that I think is so important, because as we get this maker revolution coming along, and it's not me and my dad and a few other people. The Media Lab at MIT have got the high-low tech group. This is what they are there for. And as people get the means of production in their own hands, much in the way, say, that IT departments have found with cloud computing, the minute you don't need to provide anything directly for them, for the end users, they'll just go out and procure it themselves. They'll use Dropbox rather than using your dreadful IT systems. And the same is going to happen to the value of design in all its senses if we don't get much more empathetic about the needs of the end user, because they'll just go out and do it themselves. Thank you. I will now get off my hobby horse.